Welcome everyone to this talk. My name is Ben Williams. I'm an assistant professor of yoga studies and Hinduism at Naropa University in Colorado in the US. And it's my great pleasure to be offering this lecture for the Diamond Jubilee for the Sanskrit department at the University of Mumbai in honor of their 60th anniversary. My paper is on Abhinavagupta's non-dual ethics. And the title is Advaitachara, non-duality, and Abhinavagupta's social ethic. And part of the inspiration for this talk and this subject came from an exploration of how Abhinavagupta's non-dual philosophy can be understood or translated into an ethical system, and if that's even possible. The reason there may be some doubt about this is because of a number of important scholars looking at the relationship between mysticism and ethics and showing that traditions that have a non-dual philosophy or cosmology often are difficult to translate into moral systems or ethical systems. Some of the reasons include the strange and transgressive behaviors of non-dual mystics. They're kind of beyond all social conventions. Their actions in this world are unexpected, and so there's question about how we can develop a consistent ethical framework based upon that kind of unpredictable conduct. Another reason is that these traditions often involve, through meditative or yogic or ritual technologies, the dissolution of the individual self. And so we may wonder, how is an ethical agent preserved when one no longer identifies with a separate self that's in relationship to all other beings and environments? And this continues on to another concern, which is, how is the other preserved? Arguably, ethics is really based in a sense of responsibility to another, be it an individual or a community of individuals. And so, is it possible to have a non-dual ethics? That's one piece. Another piece is an assumption that we find in a lot of modern spirituality, specifically communities that have embraced Hinduism, embraced Buddhism in America and Europe, that if somebody is awakened, if someone has reached the goal of a particular mystical tradition, it means that they're automatically perfectly ethical, that they are moral, that they are kind of have a pristine ethical life. And this assumption kind of conflates these two different dimensions of life. And so a lot of scholars have tried to separate this out and say that it's possible to have an extraordinary awakening. It's possible to have incredible insight into reality. It's possible to be illuminated and yet still be a bad person, at least in certain moments. And so a lot of this corrective has been about distinguishing mystical awareness and moral intelligence. Although they do come together in some cases, they're not necessarily the same thing. And while the separation of mysticism and ethics offers this important corrective, once we move past this arguably modern sentiment that mystics are moral by definition, there are reasons to actually consider how ethical and social codes were embodied in traditions that centered on mystical experience and non-dual perspectives. And so this is a case study in a certain sense, looking at Abhinavagupta's teachings, his tantric literature, and trying to see if we can in fact recover some sense of a social ethic from these materials. And where we should look is, the first place we will look is Abhinavagupta's teaching of the Samaya. The Samaya is the vows that a new initiate to a tantric community takes immediately after they receive initiation. And this is the entry-level initiation called Samaya Diksha. They're given by the guru, and in this initial period of their life in the community, they must follow these rules very strictly. And in a certain sense, these are injunctions and prohibitions. They're a really clear moral code that is at the heart of many different classical tantric traditions. Shaiva and Shakta traditions are what I'm going to focus on. Then Abhinavagupta, in addition to having a really clear teaching of these codes, so clearly an ethical system, teaches about certain advanced practitioners going beyond these codes, not being bound by these restrictive prohibitions and injunctions. And this culminates in something which I'm going to call an ethics of freedom. Even though one is beyond all rules, all social conventions, and even the rules of the tantric community, it doesn't mean that they're immoral. I'm going to argue that there's still certain principles based on a non-dual view of the universe and of the self that preserve a kind of ethics, although we might say that it's transmoral, it's beyond good and evil, it's beyond all of these dichotomizing rules. And so that's what I'm going to explore as an ethics of freedom. And one way to really locate Abhinavagupta's tradition is to see it within a broader array of Shaiva tantric traditions, and even lay Shaivism, which is popular forms of Shaivism based on the Puranas and the Shiva Dharma literature. And so you can see here, there's an article by Judith Torzak, whose Dharma, Shaiva and Shakta community rules, and Dharma Shastric prescriptions. This is a really useful article that lays out these different strata of the tradition, which are seen by Abhinavagupta, who's a Kaulatrika, as kind of levels from more broader universal teachings to more restricted teachings for initiates that are more esoteric or more secret. And his tradition, the Kaulatrika, is kind of the most essential tradition, which is only if one passes through these other traditions can one access these teachings. That can happen gradually, or in some rare cases, rather quickly. But basically, what's interesting about appreciating these different stages of tradition from more general to more restricted is that the more general we go, the closer we are to Brahminical social practice, meaning the rules and obligations and sensibilities that are set forth in the Dharma Sutras and in the Dharma Shastra. So based upon, the Vedic tradition. And thus, when we get to the Kaulatrika, we're very far removed from that Vedic foundation in terms of the social world. And so we have to appreciate Abhinavagupta's Samaya as kind of responding to these other layers or these other levels of tradition, which have their own unique social codes, which kind of operate within that area. Okay, so if we kind of go past lay Shaivism or popular Shaivism, the first truly tantric tradition of initiatory Shaivism is the Shaiva Siddhanta. And the Shaiva Siddhanta does actually move beyond the rules of the Brahminical orthodoxy. It does, for example, offer initiation to people from all castes. It does even offer a special initiation for women who are unable to perform the daily rites, but they still are able to receive initiation. However, they still follow a lot of the conventions. There's a lot of continuity with the broader Brahminical world, especially when it comes to ritual offerings and practices of observing purity. And even within the community, although initiation is open to all members of all the four castes, nonetheless, there's still, in certain cases, distinctions that are made for people of different castes once they're in the community. An example of this is from the Somashambhu Padati, which teaches that people of different castes within the collective community must eat in separate rows. And when we move to the Bhairava Tantras, we're actually moving further away from this world of the Dharma Shastra and the kind of different rules that guide it. And this is where we see the embracing of impure ritual substances, doing practices in cremation grounds, and engaging different observances that would, for a Brahmin, be incredibly defiling, and they would never approach. And also, we see a radical rejection of any distinctions on the basis of caste. And so I want to read this quote from the Swachanda Tantra. Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Shudras all have the same nature, since they are made one with the nature of Shiva through initiation. They are all now said to be Jatadhara, wearing matted hair with body smeared with ash, like Shiva. So they have these same dharmas, or same qualities or nature as Shiva. All entry-level initiates, therefore, should eat in the same row. Oh, beautiful face goddess. There is one line for full initiates, one for adepts, and one for gurus. But there is no separation of lines for full initiates, based on the difference of the community members' previous caste. So within these lines, it's just based on the stage of your initiation. If you're an entry-level full initiate, a sadhaka who's performing practices for siddhi, or a acharya or a guru. But within those lines, there's no differentiation based on caste. You do not separate people on caste. Shudras are eating side by side with Brahmins. Their caste in this community setting is now simply the one auspicious and unchanging caste of Bhairava. Here the word is Bhairaviya Jati. Their Jati is Bhairaviya. Taking refuge in this tantra, one should never mention the previous caste of full initiates, adepts, and entry-level initiates. As a result of mentioning former caste, O goddess, one must pay the price. They will be cooked in hell for 3 days of Rudra, 5 days of Vishnu, and 1 fortnight of Brahma. If the ultimate goal is desired, remain free of discrimination on the basis of caste. By remaining free of discrimination, empowerment, siddhi, and liberation, mukti, are certain. So here we have a further remove, we're at a further remove from the basic rules that govern texts like Manusmriti, where there are certain observances for Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Shudras. They're separated based on, especially when it comes to the practice of eating. And there's kind of a lot of different distinctions made upon this basis. Here, any distinction made on the basis of caste results in prayaschitti, being someone who has to do atonement or pay the price. And here the price is quite extreme. It's being burned in hell for a very, very, very long time. And so the command is to see each other as being a part of one jati. And it's because everyone in this community has been merged in Shiva in the act of initiation, and therefore one must be an avivekan, free of discrimination. And this is foundational to reaching the goal of these traditions, siddhi and mukti. And so here's a Sanskrit. You can see I've highlighted this idea of Jatir Bhairaviya. And Kshamarāja, in his commentary on the Swachanda Tantra, he's one of Abhinavagupta's disciples, elaborates what it means to be free of discrimination. It means seeing all initiates, just like oneself, as being one with Shiva. And so it's not just a lack of making these distinctions. It's also an active process of seeing all community members as Shivaikya, as unified or fused with Shiva. We also find, as I mentioned, a kind of embrace of different power substances. These are substances which are seen to be completely impure: bodily fluids, blood, alcohol, sometimes feces, and these are actually used in different rituals, alcohol. And so in the Brahmayamala, for example, we see this idea of an initiation that's done by consuming the charu, which is this kind of little ball of food made of these impure substances. And when one consumes it, they must have a kind of Advaita bhava. They must have the propensity or the awareness of non-duality, which refers to a ritual attitude of not distinguishing between pure and impure. The idea is that when you're constantly distinguishing between pure and pure, it creates incredible anxiety, and that doesn't allow one to be free or empowered in this case. And so I wanted to share this quote, and it's translated by Shaman Hatley. To obtain supernatural powers of one's clan, one must stand in front of the goddess present on the mandala with a non-dual mental disposition, without having any reticence concerning the charu ritual. By merely eating the charu of impure bodily substances, one obtains supernatural power of the Kecharis, the skygoers. And so what's interesting about this Advaita Bhava is it seems to be both a ritual observance of going beyond the distinction between pure and impure and embracing impure substances, these power substances, but it also seems to be a disposition of not making distinctions. And here we have a kind of rule, a command to maintain this non-dual awareness in the presence of the goddess or the goddesses. And this takes us to Abhinavagupta. In a certain sense, all of these traditions are in the background for Abhinavagupta. He's basing his tradition primarily on Shakta lineages, specifically the Trika tradition, which centers on 3 goddesses. And he's also kind of broadening the scope of his study of all tantric traditions and trying to harmonize them into this grand whole. This is the project of the Tantra Loka. And in chapter 15, he teaches 95 verses, and we can see this agenda in his description of the vows, the samaya that a new initiate must take. He draws some rules from broader universal Shaivism. He draws some rules even that go all the way back to the Dharma literature, specifically around conduct with the guru. And then there's other rules from the Bhairava Tantras and even from the Shakta Tantras and the Kaula tradition. So he's really kind of creating the synthesis within the set of community rules and articulating this really robust ethical sensibility. And so here we have an idea that we saw in the Swachanda Tantra. He says, one should not see all those who have a standing in the scriptural tradition according to their previous social identity, their pura jati, nor should one speak or act towards them in those terms. One should only see, speak, and act towards other community members as being non-different from Shiva. And I could explore a lot of the community rules, but I'm going to focus on jati because I think it'll give us a really clear thread to trace in terms of Abhinavagupta's non-dual ethics. So later on, describing jati or caste, he says one should immediately abandon these 8 understandings: jati, class; Brahminical knowledge, vidya; kula, one's past family; achara, social norms of conduct; deha, the body; desha, one's regional identity; excellences, gunas, and also wealth. So completely abandon one's identification with all of these things as if they were spirit possessors, as if they were grahas, literally evil spirits, shown to be impenetrable. And then he gives an example of how one should let this go, or how these different grahas work. He says, I am a Brahmin. How can I do something other than what is taught in the Vedic scriptures? This awareness is the possession that is cast, the ultimate obstacle. And so how does jati, how does this identity affect one and become an obstacle? It does it by making us identify with, in this case, one of the 4 castes, and then on the basis of that identification, being compelled to act based on that identity in a very specific and limited way, and not being able to go against any of those ways of life. And so in this sense, it kind of contracts the horizon of the possibility of our lives. And therefore, it's paranirodhakaha, it's the ultimate nirodhaka, the obstructor. The others as well should be illustrated in this manner by one who follows the profound path of the goddess tradition. So the same illustration should be given by the guru, presumably, about all of these other identity markers, about one's previous notions of conduct, one's family identity, one's body. Then he elaborates this way in which the graha, that is jati, clouds our awareness. And this is an extraordinary description. By displaying an identity with a self-nature that is not inherent, by veiling one's essence, this conception is shown here to be similar to an evil spirit of possession. And so what this idea of caste, this graha of jati does, is it reveals an identity that is atat swabhava. It's not based on our swabhava. It's artificial. It's not actually our true swabhava. And it also achadika. It conceals our swarupa. It kind of covers over our swarupa. And so this is how this graha of jati works. He goes on to say, powerfully, there is no conceptual construct such as caste in the nature of consciousness. That construct completely veils one's nature with an extrinsic identity. The nature of consciousness in reality is undivided. Any concept that contracts it is a form of possession. And so abandon it. Tam parityajet. So here, not only is caste a graha, it's a kalpana, it's a concept, it's a mere concept. And it's a concept that contracts sankochakarini, samvit tattvasya, the reality of consciousness. And this reality of, how does it contract it? This reality of consciousness is described as being akanditatmanaha. Its nature is unbroken, undivided. And so the way in which it contracts it is it divides consciousness. But really, within this consciousness, there is no such kalpana like jati. They actually don't exist in consciousness. They're just projected upon it. Or there are contractions or crystallizations that consciousness freely makes, as we'll see. So here, at least when it comes to the kula, the community of tantric initiates, one must abandon caste as if it were a demon, a graha. His description of why abandoning these kalpanas is necessary communicates key aspects of Abhinavagupta's non-dual view. The notion that ultimate reality, the self of all beings with which they are fused in the liberating process of initiation, is non-dual consciousness. This consciousness is a reality that is definitionally beyond all concepts, and it becomes obscured by all of these different social constructs that arise within it, which cloud it and contract it, leading to a crystallization of a very fixed identity and role in the world. In this way, Abhinavagupta has explained, and we just saw, social identities are like possessing spirits. They're obstacles to the liberating recognition of this indivisible consciousness that is the self of all beings. Furthermore, concepts of caste, etc., they are actually invade the relational environment of the initiatory community. So therefore, you must protect them from actually entering into the space. They kind of come and disturb the space. So the injunction to let go of all past socially conditioned identities thus can be appreciated as a non-dual ethic that serves as a basis for new forms of social life within the clan of initiates. And this is really interesting to think about. If we have this injunction to see all other initiates as nothing but Shiva, what kind of forms of relationship emerge from that ethical injunction, from that way of being? What kind of moral principles can be developed or derived from seeing each community member, including one's own self, as nothing but Shiva, and not seeing them based upon all of their past identities that they come to the community with? So clearly we have something like a non-dual ethic. I think that's pretty interesting and compelling. However, the question we had in the beginning, which is, how non-dual traditions go beyond all rules and all social practice and have these extraordinary, surprising and intense forms of behavior that are displayed by their great masters and mystics and teachers. Abhinavagupta himself also argues that for very select and highly advanced audience, these rules can be broken. And here he draws on the base text for the Tantra Loka, the Malini Vijayottara Tantra, this very important Trika scripture. And in the 18th chapter, we have something of a Kaula teaching from this text, which goes beyond the earlier parts of the text. And we have this really fascinating statement that Abhinavagupta cites from the Malini Vijayottara, which he then goes to comment on at the conclusion of chapter 4. And so I want to read the Malini statement that he cites. And this is kind of the idea of going beyond the rules that govern the Samayans. Here, in this Kaula teaching, this kind of advanced teaching, there is neither purity, impurity, nor hesitation about taking impure food and other substances. There's neither duality nor non-duality. There's neither worship of the linga nor renouncing that worship. There's neither the presence or the absence of the rule of owning possessions. You don't adopt or renounce matted hair, ash, and the like. The practice of or avoidance of observances, visiting sacred sites, maintaining tantric vows, the sectarian marks inherent to other traditions, name and lineage. In this system, in this Kaula teaching, none of these are enjoined or prohibited. Everything is enjoined in this teaching, and everything too is prohibited. So here the Malini presents this paradox. It does it both positively and negatively. Nothing is enjoined and nothing is prohibited, and everything is enjoined and everything is prohibited. What does that mean? It means that you're not bound to do certain things and prohibited from others, but you're also not bound to do things and be prohibited, meaning you have freedom to do what you like or to not do what you like. Neither injunction or prohibition or kind of avoiding rules is binding or compelling. And in culmination, the Malini says, however, this is enjoined here as a rule, as a niyama. The yogi, remaining calm, should fix his mind firmly upon reality. He should adopt whatever form of practice enables him to achieve that. And so here we have a radical proposition that attempts to go beyond the interplay of injunction and prohibition, to go beyond do's and don'ts. Instead, what we end here with is an open injunction, something like, do whatever will allow you to become firmly rooted in reality. And so the beginning of Abhinavagupta's most esoteric chapter of the Tantra Loka, chapter 29, which introduces consort practice, this Kula Yaga, reserved for highly qualified adepts, we find the very same sentiment. He says the Kula ritual is whatever a tantric master performs with their mind, speech, and body to become established in their own divine nature. And so one's not bound by the samaya, one's not bound by certain commands or certain sets and disciplines of practice. There's a kind of freedom, but it's not immoral. It's not do anything you want towards any end. It's do whatever it takes in order to become established in tattva, in order to go beyond all forms of dualistic awareness. And this also means, again, quite radically, going beyond any sectarian identity, even the Trika tradition, which he's firmly rooting his own teachings in, which he sees as the highest revelation. And so there's kind of two steps that lead to this ethics of freedom as I'm exploring it. The first is that there's the essence of community rules of conduct that are taught in the Shaiva scriptures, and those are codes that must be observed right after you receive Samaya Diksha. But then there's another step. In the Mata scriptures, there's a rejection of community rules and codes of conduct, since they're seen to sustain duality. So if you're kind of if there's an enforcement of certain tantric initiatory rules, which are based on those different tantric initiation lineages, then in certain texts, they actually say you can reject those rules completely. You're no longer bound by them because those rules are dualistic. They create divisions in consciousness. And another way of saying that is that by going beyond these diverse rules, you purify the concepts that conceal reality, and thus we find the teaching that one should know their innate awareness, which is all-encompassing and unrestrained by rules and codes of conduct. So here we have a clear step to go beyond rules. And by extension, even the rules of the highest and most esoteric traditions that are at the core of all revelation, and that for Abhinavagupta is the Trika. And so he says, for whereas consciousness is all-encompassing, injunction and prohibition, vidhi and nisheda, are merely differential constructs freely manifested within its nature. They cannot comprise that nature itself. If one desires to penetrate ultimate reality, one has only to adopt whatever method one feels to be most conducive in a given circumstance. There is no requirement here that one follows a particular system. This has been taught accordingly. All goddesses, all lineages, all mantras, all scriptures, all methods are equal, for all are Shiva. Okay, this is a radical statement, and it may lead to this question of how Abhinavagupta's statement that all pervasive consciousness cannot be accessed or divided by injunction or prohibition, how can that ever lead to something like an ethical framework? Because arguably, vidhi and nisheda is really the sets of practices or norms that would govern any ethical life. There has to be principles. By turning this understanding into a command to do or avoid whatever one must in order to become established in reality, I'm arguing that an injunctive and thus an ethical force is still at play here for Abhinavagupta. Therefore, this teaching can be understood as an ethical code in service of freedom. It does so by mimicking consciousness's most distinctive feature, creative autonomy, swatantriya. This is consciousness's power to become anything and everything, and to never lose that freedom, even within the manifest world of time and space and causality, and by extension, social life. And so in conclusion, I think it's really important to remember that Abhinavagupta has multiple audiences at play here, and that each audience, there's an integrity to their different ethical visions, and one should not just simply ignore them. There's a process of going to deeper and deeper and subtler levels of revelation. And so moving through those systems, there's an integrity to the ethics at every level, and there's a pushing away from outer forms of ethical systems in order to get closer and closer to consciousness and the freedom of consciousness. And as one does get closer and closer to that freedom, they start to go beyond kind of limited rule-based ethical systems. And this itself is ethical. Transgressing earlier norms is itself an ethical posture. And this ethical foundation in community rules, which is tied to an identification with a lineage and a body of scriptures and a set of practices and an actual living community and particular mantra deities one worships, is actually followed by a transcendence of sectarian identity, as we saw in this final quote, and also a transcendence of any divisions. And this, I think, can be appreciated as an ethics of freedom. And in doing so, one's way of being in the world, one's awareness is mimicking, or maybe that's too much of a kind of distant word, or maybe embodying consciousness's most important feature, swatantriya, its freedom. So that's my talk. It's been wonderful to be a part of this lecture series. And thank you so much for the hosts of this series for inviting me, and take care.